Hello, I'm Kshitij, co-founder and CTO at Orb. Orb, as I was introduced, is a usage-based billing infrastructure company. So we power cloud billing for lots of companies across infrastructure, but specifically, especially some of the faster-growing ones in AI. Today's talk is not primarily about billing or even about Orb. It is about pricing. So I just want to jump straight into that. It's a lightning talk. We only have so much time. So let's start. Pricing you should think of as friction. Ultimately, your customers don't want to think about pricing. They want to use your product. But friction can be good. Friction is how you assess customer value. It's how you understand whether you're building something that's actually useful to the audience that you're targeting. So you start thinking about pricing like friction. You can think of it as steps in a new user flow where adding some friction is good, adding too much friction leads to drop-off, and so you need to think about how to balance those two things. There's three key principles I want to cover today around pricing. The first is thinking about your audience. Ultimately, your pricing is for someone, just like your product is for someone, and ideally those two things match. Your margin structure, we are talking to a crowd of folks in AI, and I'm sure that costs and margins are very top of mind for a lot of people here. And then pricing flexibility. I think this is one of the things that most companies think about not enough or perhaps too late, and it's something, especially in a fast-moving landscape like AI, you need to start thinking about early. So let's start with the first. You really need to think about your target audience for your product and your pricing. This starts by thinking through what is the segment that you are attempting to capture, how are they thinking about the buying decision overall. Oftentimes AI companies are selling to a combination of individual developers as well as big enterprises, and as many of you know, big enterprises have procurement teams and buying processes, and if you try to deploy that same pricing and go-to-market and sales motion at an individual developer, they're going to be like, hey, just give me the product, I want to start using it. And so thinking about how your pricing relates to your audience is really important. In almost all cases, having simple and predictable pricing is very important. There are some companies that challenge this, and I'll show you a few examples, but you can only challenge this with lots of market pull and with extreme care. And you should think about how your pricing is changing the behavior of your target audience, because your pricing creates incentives and it causes your customers not only to buy in a specific way, but also use your product in a specific way, and we'll cover some examples of that. So maybe to start, here's an example. You all have probably seen this page. It is the pricing page for AWS Aurora. Aurora is a database offering from AWS, and this pricing page tells a story. Probably many stories. One is it is very in the weeds, so it is clearly targeted at people who understand the context of Aurora. It's a pretty complicated pricing page. You can see that the pricing axes are in terabytes per month. That tells a story about how Aurora is meant to be used, at what data scale it's meant to be used. That's very purposeful. And perhaps the thing that's highlighted with this arrow, data transfer in is free to AWS, but data transfer out is not. That tells a story of incentives, and obviously AWS wants you to bring data in to their platform, and so they're pushing incentives by this pricing model. Lots of people who think about pricing will see, especially engineers, will see a page like this and be like, oh, this is shitty, right? Like, this is not a pricing page, this is a contact us page, I want a pricing page. But I think it is worth saying that contact sales for a custom quote is about the audience. It's just not meant for an individual developer. ServiceNow is presumably not selling to you if you look at this page and say, oh my God, that sucks. And in reality, probably in this case, ServiceNow is trying to cross-sell their new product to people who are already using ServiceNow. So the value sale and understanding what the existing usage pattern is for that audience is very important. And so talking to a salesperson is kind of a critical part of their go-to-market and sales process. Let's look at another example. This is Cloudflare. And this is pricing for R2, which is their product that competes with or compares to S3. This is a good example because Cloudflare has done a bunch of work, and we'll see it in a couple examples later on, to differentiate their product and their architecture and their pricing. But you need to think about where people are coming from. If someone is used to paying for S3 in a specific way, whether that's API operations or storage, and now they're trying to size up how would it look like to move this workload to R2, it's important that you make that transition as easy as possible. And if they can't predict how their workload is going to compare or how they're going to map quantities on S3 to quantities on R2, they're going to have a much, much harder time making the buying decision. And so there's a very different pricing motion you have to go through when thinking through a lift and shift use case versus a net new use case where, it's a new product that maybe people haven't thought about the pricing dimensions for before. Let's talk about the second structure, which is margins and costs. Many of you have probably heard this quote, "Your margin is my opportunity," really getting at this idea that ultimately, you can set pricing arbitrarily, you can have really great margins, but especially now when the cost of building software is getting lower, a new company will come in and take that opportunity to undercut your margin. So this is an area that I think increasingly so you have to think critically about. I think the big takeaway here is think about your cost structure. Given the architecture of your product, what does it scale with, rather than thinking about the exact costs? Ultimately, if OpenAI or Anthropic or a different underlying model compute provider changes or halves costs overnight, which is prone to happen, your literal cost will change, but your cost structure will probably stay the same. So a couple things, think about the axis on which your costs scale and how that relates to your pricing, and think about what architectural advantages you have that you can then pass on into your pricing. Ultimately, that's going to be something that is harder for other people to just track one for one. So if you think about costs, there's roughly 3 costs. There's, especially in AI, there's models, there's the training of the models, and then there's the DevOps around the model. So of course, it depends on which layer you're operating, but you have to think about all of these costs when you're thinking about pricing your product, because ultimately none of them are likely to converge to zero. They're all going to have some marginal cost. And let's look at a few examples. So in this case, this is an example of Cloudflare again, and you can see they're charging for CPU milliseconds. I think this is their Workers product. Cloudflare made an early architecture decision to build on top of Worker isolates, which are much more lightweight ways of running serverless functions. This lets them charge not for wall time, but for CPU time specifically, and I think this is a great advantage compared to other serverless products. And again, it's an example of them taking an early architectural bet, that panning out, and then them being able to translate that to specific value for the use cases that they're trying to power for their customers. Another good example, this is from Modal. Modal has done a bunch of work to make very specific optimizations to their underlying file system, and they've done a ton of infrastructure low-level work, and so they can charge at a very, very granular level per second. And this is the sort of thing where imagine cold starts were really expensive on this platform, charging per second just wouldn't make sense. And so translating that underlying architecture to a pricing decision. Sometimes costs aren't the higher order bit. This specific article has been debated many times over. Regardless of this example, GitHub charges for Copilot on a $seat basis. Does that really make sense for margins? Probably not. There are probably lots of customers who use Copilot a lot, and there are customers who don't use Copilot at all, so their margins are probably pretty funky. But simplicity matters too. And so this is another example of Slack charging for AI on a $seat basis, because they're really trying to just push adoption of Slack's AI product. Let's talk a little bit about pricing flexibility. And so most companies think, partially because they don't have the infrastructure tooling, but partially because this is how SaaS pricing has been, they think of pricing as a set it and forget it exercise. But in reality, you're spending a ton of money on R&D, your product is changing, your value delivery is increasing, and your value capture should increase too. And if you all, engineers in the room, think of data migrations, it's the sort of thing where if you start to do it very often, it does become easier. Most companies, they have a sudden price change, which is bad for them, it's bad for their customers, whereas value is changing continually. And so the more you can converge to the picture on the right, where you're capturing that as time goes on, the better. So this is an example of Pinecone, both rolling out a serverless offering, but also changing their pricing to match, which can drive massive ROI. A pricing model we see a lot that's related to this is being able to roll something like prepaid credits out, and this gives you a ton of axes of being able to differentiate and add levers to your pricing to account for fluctuating demand or enterprise contract structures. So being able to do this can be really valuable. There's a couple of technical challenges related to implementing pricing well. Of course, there's the business logic, there's the customer experience, giving visibility, there's the auditability, and of course, there's the kind of data infrastructure. We work with companies that generate thousands or even millions of events a second that feed into their pricing. So that's what Orb does. We're a billing platform purpose-built for these use cases. We help you both implement the pricing as well as evolve it over time so that you can change your pricing much more flexibly. And that's it. Thank you for listening to the talk. We are downstairs at a booth, I think 246. Happy to take questions then, and maybe one question now.